And good evening, I'm Brooke Baldwin, and this is a CNN special, Self-Defense or Murder, the George Zimmerman trial. Today in court, a tale of two mothers from the witness stand, and in perhaps what was the most dramatic moments in this explosive case, the mothers of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin testify, each telling a very different story of those screams heard on that 911 call that night, February of last year, in which Trayvon Martin was killed. It is a pivotal piece of evidence in this case. First, let me just show you this. This is what Trayvon Martin's mother told the court this morning.
I want to play a recording for you, ma'am.
911, do you need police, fire, medical?
Maybe both. I'm not sure. There's just someone screaming outside.
Okay, what's the address that they're near?
1211
When Cheesley? Is this in the Twin Lakes homes in Sanford?
Yeah.
Okay. And is it a male or female?
It sounds like a male.
And you don't know why?
I don't know why. I think they're yelling help, but I don't know. Just send someone quick, please.
Okay. Does he look hurt to you?
I can't see him. I don't want to go out there. I don't know what's going on. So they're sending him.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
All right, what is your
Just, there's gunshots.
You just heard gunshots?
Yes.
Ma'am, that screaming or yelling, do you recognize that?
Yes.
And who do you recognize that to be, ma'am?
Trayvon Benjamin Martin.
That was this morning. The prosecution rested its case late this afternoon, and the defense picked right up, beginning its side with another mother, George Zimmerman's mother. And this is what she had to say about that exact same 911 call. Here she was.
911, do you need police, fire, medical?
I'm maybe both not sure. There's just someone screaming outside.
Okay, what's the address that they're near?
1211
Cheesley. Is this in the Twin Lakes homes in Sanford?
Yeah.
Okay. And is it a male or female?
It sounds like a male.
And you don't know why?
I don't know why. I think they're yelling help, but I don't know. Just send someone quick, please.
Okay. Does he look hurt to you?
I can't see him. I don't want to go out there. I don't know what's going on. So they're sending him.
So you keep yelling help?
Yes.
All right, what is your number?
Were you able to hear that voice?
Yes, sir.
In the background?
Yes.
You heard, of course, a woman's voice in the foreground, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you know whose voice that was screaming in the background?
Yes, sir.
And whose voice was that?
My son, George.
And are you certain of that?
Because he's my son.
Two mothers, two stories, both women recognizing the voice as that of her son. We'll speak live coming up to George Zimmerman's defense attorney, Mark O'Mara, in just a moment. But first, let's go straight to Sanford, Florida, to Martin Savage, who's been covering this trial day in and day out. And Martin, what an afternoon. I mean, first we opened with this final day for the state. We see the mother of Trayvon Martin testifying, and then not even sure if the defense would call its first witness today. Here we have out of the gate the mother of George Zimmerman, incredibly dramatic in that courtroom.
Yep, Brooke, hello to you. And absolutely, without a doubt, this was the most dramatic day so far in this trial. And as you point out, I mean, it was widely known that when the prosecution was ready to wrap up its case, it would put Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mother, on the stand and ask her the question that everybody knew was going to be asked. Who was that voice screaming that you hear? I don't think anyone anticipated that in the very same day, George Zimmerman's mother, Gladys, would take the stand and be asked the same exact question after hearing the same exact audio. Take a listen again.
Ma'am, that screaming or yelling, do you recognize that?
Yes.
And who do you recognize that to be, ma'am?
Trayvon Benjamin Martin.
Do you know whose voice that was screaming in the background?
Yes, sir.
And whose voice was that?
My son, George.
And are you certain of that?
Because he's my son.
And of course, it was one mother that began the testimony today, and it was another that almost was the very last voice that the jury heard before they went off on their weekend break. Brooke?
Before they went off on their weekend, after hearing from the mother of George Zimmerman, then they hear from this uncle who, without equivocation, again, saying that the screams on that 911 call were without a doubt that of his nephew.
Right, and what made this really powerful, and I should point out that there was another family member, and that was the older brother of Trayvon Martin that was called to the witness stand, and he too said, look, I know that voice, it is Trayvon Martin. But as you point out, later in the day, we had the uncle, who is a sheriff's deputy in Orange County. He said he heard those screams on the news, and he knew instantly who that voice was.
Not only I just heard the scream, I felt the scream, like my nephew is screaming for his life. It was a moment that I actually lived with me every moment that I heard the portion of that, because it was, you know, the feeling of saying, oh, I heard Georgie. It was George screaming for his life.
And a notation to that, Brooke, on the side of the courtroom, George down into tears as he listened to his uncle make that description.
I was watching him wiping away what looked to be tears, swallowing hard, listening to his family members. Here he was for the first time showing emotion there in court. And one more testimony I have to ask you about, Martin, as we look at these pictures here. But before resting the case this afternoon, the state calls this associate medical examiner. I tell you, I talked to a number of attorneys today. They called this man's testimony bad, wishy-washy, rigid. What did you make of this?
He was all over the map. Shipping Bao is the assistant medical advisor here on this particular case. He was the one who actually did the autopsy on 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Now, he did make a number of points. One of them was fairly dramatic, especially when he talked about the fact that he believed that Trayvon, though shot in the heart, lived on for some time. Listen.
It is my opinion that he was still alive, he was still in pain, he was still in suffering.
Objection, Your Honor.
And then on cross-examination, though, the defense was able to get Dr. Bao to admit that there had been a number of procedural errors that could have impacted the evidence or the body's evidence. And one other thing that he brought out, he kept saying repeatedly, and this didn't help at all with his testimony, he did not remember even doing Trayvon Martin's autopsy. Brooke?
Martin Savage for us in Sanford, Florida. Martin, we'll come back to you later this hour. Thank you so much. I want to bring in now Daryl Parks. He's the co-counsel for the Martin family. Mr. Parks, nice to see you tonight. Let me begin with today, which was absolutely the most dramatic day of this trial, with these two mothers testifying both in the morning and then in the afternoon. And here I can't help but think of these 6 female jurors, 5 of whom are women. And my question to you really is, I know what side you're taking here, but how is the jury to determine which mother to believe?
Well, I think this jury has to weigh all of the evidence in this case. I think that they've heard from various family members in this case, and they get to weigh their believability. I think one of the witnesses testified that he heard the screams but didn't hear the other TV audio that took place. They'll have to weigh that evidence in this case.
We know that the state rested its case today, and the prosecution, as we were just talking about, ended with this Dr. Bao, this medical examiner who changed his mind, was all over the place, has really been criticized for much of his testimony. Powerful witnesses here, though, because you have the defense today, starting with George Zimmerman's mother and then this uncle, and here you have the jury leaving for the weekend, and the final thing, that the freshest testimony on their minds is that from the defense. Pretty emotional, riveting stuff from the defense. Strategy-wise, how concerned are you about that?
I'm not concerned at all. You used the term pivotal earlier in the telecast here, and I don't think that this case is going to hinge just upon whose voice you're hearing, right? There's no question that there was a fight. At the end of the day, we've heard testimony in this case also that whoever was on top was holding down the arms of George Zimmerman with his legs, right, and holding the nose and mouth. And probably even most importantly, though, we heard the testimony of Mr. Good, who does not talk about the beating that George alleges that he took, right? And at the end of the day, we do not believe that George Zimmerman had to pull out a gun and shoot Trayvon Martin in the heart. But beyond that, we should not forget that this incident never happens if George Zimmerman follows the instructions of the 911 operator and stays in his vehicle as he was instructed.
There have been a number of inconsistencies, certainly in this trial, differing versions depending on the eyewitnesses, and we'll have to see who the defense decides to call as we look ahead to the next week. But let me just play some sound for you, because we heard from the defense attorney, Mark O'Mara, once court ended for this Friday afternoon, and he was pretty critical of some of the state's strategy. I want to play you this.
I wasn't surprised by what they put on. I was probably more surprised by what they didn't put on. Well, there are other family members in the Martin family that I would have imagined that they would have called, so that was a bit of a surprise to me. A lot of the law enforcement officers who had heavy involvement in the case was a surprise to me that they sort of excised that out of their case. So they can communicate exactly what they want to do, only present what they want, but I thought it was quite abbreviated with law enforcement, family members, probably the two areas.
So abbreviated, and I've talked to other folks in Sanford who sort of agree. They anticipated more members of law enforcement, more members of Trayvon Martin's family to testify. That didn't happen. Your response to that?
Well, number one, they obviously have the right to bring on other witnesses after the defense puts on their case, number one. Number two, I think it was pretty strong when you listen to the directed verdict arguments today. It was very powerful, some of the things that Attorney Manti said in representing the state's interest in doing so. It was very pointed and very clear, but also, too, when the judge made her ruling, she made it very clear that in proving the case for second-degree murder, that she believed that the state had put on both direct evidence, circumstantial evidence supporting the case and charges.
I think many people, though, know a JOA, judgment of acquittal, is procedure at best, and that was anticipated that this judge, would toss out the defense argument that there's not enough evidence. But let me move on. Just on an emotional level, you're in touch with the family, sir. We saw Sabrina Martin testify early this morning. This grieving mother, I can't imagine having to sit there and speak about a dead 17-year-old child of hers. She tweeted this morning. Let me just read this tweet. Quote, Day 19, I pray that God gives me strength to properly represent my angel, Trayvon. He may not be perfect, but he's mine. I plead the blood of Jesus for healing. I don't know how much, Mr. Parks, you have been in touch with Ms. Fulton, but is she, and how is Tracy Martin? How are they holding up?
It's been tough. I've been with them every day this week. It's been a very, very hard struggle. They've been very prayerful. Obviously, she knew she would testify this week, and it was tough for her getting ready to go in there to and to speak up for her son. It was tough in that you got to sit there and think about some of the questions that she was asked, right? Question and to go through that, what she had to go through in the questioning, in the cross-examination, she endured it. She endured it because she's very committed to the legacy of her son, and God has continued to keep her, Javaris, and Tracy. And I have Javaris, he's a very quiet person. He did an incredible job to come in there and to represent his younger brother who had lost his life. So it was a tough day for her. I can tell you at the end of the day, she was still keeping it together. Told me she was. Remember, she has been here every day through these proceedings to make sure that her son gets justice, and we believe that she will.
Daryl Parks, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much. You bring up some of the criticism about the cross-examination of Sabrina Fulton. We will ask the man himself who did that cross-exam, Mr. Mark O'Mara, George Zimmerman's defense attorney, joining me live. Coming up next, do not miss this.